Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Access Vikings podcast. My name is Emily Leiker. I'm joined by Ben Gessling and Andrew Kramer, all of us of the Minnesota Star Tribune. We're coming to you each from our own residences this evening, no longer in Indianapolis, thank God, as the Sam Darnold 2025 offseason saga kind of pushes on another week here after the Vikings decided not to franchise tag him. Franchise tag deadline was today at 3 p.m. local time. Only 2 players ended up being tagged, which we'll get into. But Ben, I'll go to you. We heard last week that this was probably going to be what happened with Sam. We talked to some people in Indianapolis and just didn't sound like they were going to use the tag on him. Can you kind of talk us through why that was again? I know you've already written about it, but how we got to this place after, several weeks of thinking maybe this was in play for the Vikings.
Yeah, it's been an interesting kind of thought process, and we've all kind of looked at this through the offseason, and then when you get in front of people who actually have to think through these things on a daily basis, you learn a little bit more, which is kind of how the reporting process is supposed to work, right? I mean, you go in kind of thinking, hey, it could work this way, but then you talk to people who know more than you, and then some of that stuff kind of opens your eyes to what the teams are thinking about all of these things. Basically, where this landed for the Vikings was if you were going to give Sam Darnold a franchise tag with the idea that you're trading him, you are effectively giving him a no-trade clause, because he would have had to say to the Vikings and the new team, yes, I am planning to sign a long-term deal here. If he had said or indicated that he wasn't going to do that, that team is probably going to say, you know what, we don't really want to make this deal. So effectively, that scuttles the trade. So Darnold would have had a lot more leverage as a result of the tag if you were planning to use it for the means of trading him. Now, does this mean that the window is closed for him to come back? I don't know that it does entirely. My understanding is that they are still talking about a long-term deal. They are still talking about a deal that could work for both sides. I think this is probably kind of similar to what we saw with Kirk Cousins last year. Obviously, the details are different because Darnold's 27. He's healthy. He's not 35, 36, coming off of an Achilles. But I think their approach to this is going to be very similar in the sense of they're going to have a level, say, we want to be here. And if you're good with something in that neighborhood, we can figure something out. If not, if you want to test the market and see where that puts you, you're free to go do that. So it will depend probably on Sam Darnold's receptiveness to what the Vikings are thinking. We certainly saw it with Kirk Cousins last year where he said, I want to go maximize my market. I want to go see what's out there. It only takes one team. I think there maybe only was one team that wanted to go to that level with Kirk last year. He found it. He went to the Falcons, and we've watched that whole thing with a certain level of interest since then. But I think with Darnold, it's going to be this question of, does he want to see what the market has for him? Does he feel like he has a strong market? And how badly does he want to stay in Minnesota? We'll get a better answer to all of these things probably in the next 4 to 5 days, I would think. But that's my understanding of where we stand with it at the moment.
And Andrew, we're at that point where the market kind of changes every hour almost with quarterbacks. But I guess, can you talk us through what the market currently is for Sam and maybe what we're looking at in terms of free agents in general with quarterbacks?
Yeah, I remember this time last year, Ben brings up Kirk Cousins. I think it was this time last year. Very few people saw the Falcons coming with that $45 million offer. You don't get a real read on kind of what a guy's true market is until those dollars start falling and you really see the numbers come out. And then you learn after the fact kind of where and how we got there. And so it's hard to say what his current market is, but what we do know is that there are more teams that need a starting quarterback than there are starting quarterbacks available in free agency. And this draft class is not considered. Even Joe Shane, the Giants GM, said in Indy this week, like, ideally we draft that guy at number 3 overall where they currently sit, but we don't even know if that guy is in this draft. And that typically by February, March of that draft year, you kind of know if there's that bona fide got to go get him quarterback. So I just think teams don't feel great about this draft class. The Vikings didn't, which is why they decided to pick J.J. McCarthy when they did and strike in that big year last year. In that quarterback class. So that helps Darnold. And if you're talking about the Titans, who really need an immediate win now guy, or the Raiders, who are looking to restart things with their new regime and Tom Brady being very involved in what they're doing. The Steelers are a team that gets floated around quite a bit, but their GM Omar Khan came out last week and said, we'd rather keep Russell Wilson or Justin Fields. Those are our top priorities at the moment. And then at the very end, you got the Giants, who does Sam want to go back to MetLife Stadium, where it just didn't go so well, obviously, for him. And those memories could come crawling back in a way that he might not want to invite. So when Ben says that the Vikings are still interested in bringing him back and still talking at this point, it's fascinating because that could have a lot of ripple effects for the Vikings roster, for JJ McCarthy. And it would, if he came back, I think I'd have to just speculate and allude that, or assume that meant that his market was so weak and that he wasn't getting the type of, 3-year, $120 million kind of offers that we can just envision at this point. Because there are 15 different quarterbacks who make over $40 million a year. And Sam Darnold very well might have a claim to be one of those guys. It just matters. It depends on how much a team is going to want him. And as Ben said, it only takes one. We know that. That was the case with the Falcons last year. And if one of those teams we mentioned throws the bag at Sam Darnold, he's obviously gone, kind of how we all expected.
Yeah, I saw a new one pop up today in a graphic. I don't remember who it was from, and it was just a graphic. I don't know what the piece said behind it, but the Colts, throwing him out there with the Colts and maybe going and being with Anthony Richardson, which I thought was interesting. Probably not the highest on the list, but
because they say at the combine they're talking about having an open competition next year. I mean, either Ballard or Shane Steichen said that. I can't remember who, but I think that came up, didn't it?
Yeah, that sounds familiar.
Yeah, they talked about wanting to bring in a veteran who could push Anthony Richardson, meaning not just handing him the job. But if you're Sam Darnold, you want to get paid like it's going to be your job. At least Kirk Cousins thought that when he went to Atlanta. We know how that worked out. But that money usually means something. And I just can't imagine the Colts are going to spend up to the level Sam would want to leave. But if Sam wants to compete for a job, it sounds like in Minnesota, he certainly could do that if he wanted to.
Yeah.
Right. And Andrew, before we got on and started recording, we were talking about kind of the JJ McCarthy side of this. Of course, about a month ago now, 6 weeks ago, he was on the Rich Eisen show with some comments about the competition of it all and wanting to have a fair shot at this opportunity. I guess, where do you think his head is at, and how much of what we've heard from the Vikings about him? Of course, last week it was that he's back above 200 pounds. They're feeling good about him. They're always feeling good about him. How much of that do you think is factoring into this decision-making with Sam?
It's interesting. And I do think that obviously sets, when Ben's talking about the talks that are ongoing, we know the Vikings like to set a certain price on players. And I imagine Sam's price is very much with the mindset of, we're not going to rob from Peter to pay Paul. We're not going to rob from building around JJ McCarthy to necessarily throw the bag at Sam Darnold. So that all plays into it. It all goes hand in hand. And Emily, you're the one who broke down the JJ McCarthy appearance on the Rich Eisen show, where he said, all I want is an opportunity. And he might feel like, speculating here, he might feel like that you won't get a fair opportunity if you bring Darnold back, who just threw for 4,000 yards, 35 touchdowns, who they all talk about, the coaches, that these quarterbacks get better in year two. And Ben, we saw Kirk Cousins get that much better in year two under Kevin O'Connell. So why wouldn't they assume, if they brought Darnold back, that they'd try to put everything behind him to try to seek that improvement? It would be just an interesting balance that I'm not sure how they would strike it.
Well, it's funny because we do this thing so often, and we should hedge this by saying that there's still a long way to go here. They could have a lot of interest in bringing him back, and he may say, you know what, guys, that's great, but what I had in mind actually had a few more zeros on it, or at least a probably more realistically a bigger number in front of all of the zeros, I think is probably what we're talking about. But if they were to do it, it's an interesting scenario, because a lot of the places we see this where the rookie quarterback is waiting, and I think we talked about this a little bit last year, but it's Brett Favre and Aaron Rodgers, or Aaron Rodgers and Jordan Love, where it's a guy at the end of his career and you're kind of waiting for that guy to move on, and it's obvious there's going to be a baton passed. They would not have to pass the baton here if they signed Sam Darnold to a longer-term deal. And I don't know that we're talking about a 5-year deal. I could see them saying, hey, 2 years, $40 million. If he were to do that, I think they'd have all the interest in the world of doing that. But even that changes the McCarthy timeline, because you have these 4 years that you're guaranteed to have, kind of controllable quarterback costs, and that 5th-year option is still probably below market. If you start eating into those, it means that number one, you don't have as many of those years. And number two, when you do turn the thing over to the guy, kind of like the Packers had with Jordan Love, you have to make a decision pretty quickly about, is this guy worth that second contract? So I do think all of this is going to be very interesting to watch. I have a feeling it will hold the Darnold price to a certain point, just as the idea of the hypothetical rookie quarterback held the Cousins price down to a certain point last year. This rookie quarterback, or this young quarterback in this case, is no longer hypothetical. We know who he is. He's in the building. They've had a year to work with him, even though he didn't practice because of the injury. They have seen him in the building. So it's a really fascinating scenario if Darnold were to come back. And again, I think there's a long way to go for that to happen. But if it did, yeah, ramifications for a lot of people could play out in some interesting ways. And we should mention, too, that if they brought Darnold back, say it's a 2-year deal, that could still be a very tradable contract at some point. I don't think any of that should be ruled out, because if they are thinking along these lines of being pretty open-minded about how you go about this whole thing, I mean, Kwesi's talked about options. Giving themselves this many options means eventually you have to make a decision, because you don't play two of these guys generally, unless you're going to do some weird package, which they're not. So a lot of it leads to some very fascinating permutations if it were to go that way.
The Vikings have indeed created optionality at quarterback. That's the
Yes,
word that
they have.
Kwesi used last week at the podium. But to your point, Ben, the difficulty of that is that now they have that relationship with JJ McCarthy. He is not just an anonymous QB they're going to draft. JJ has that relationship with Sam, which I think is interesting as well to consider. If he comes back, they have that relationship with each other, but no franchise tag for Sam Darnold. We're going to push into free agency with him, and I'm sure that situation could get crazy next week, and we'll be there covering it all. But only 2 guys were franchise tagged this year, and that was Kansas City's Trey Smith for $23.4 million, and then Cincinnati tagged T. Higgins for $26.2 million. I guess Trey Smith had kind of been in the conversation maybe for someone the Vikings might want to be acquiring. For either of you, really, I guess, just when that went off the table, like, what does that signify about like that market right now for offensive linemen? And also, I guess I'm curious for you guys' thoughts on the T. Higgins situation as well.
Yeah, Ben, go ahead.
Yeah, I just think it's going to be interesting to watch that guard market, because Trey Smith was the guy that was probably at the top of it for a lot of people. I mean, whether it was his age, the way he played, there were a lot of things to like about him. And there are other guys on this market, but for the Chiefs to franchise tag him, it takes probably the top name off of it. And it probably tells you that that market would have been high enough that if they're trying to win a bidding war to bring him back or give him a deal that he would have been happy enough to sign ahead of time, it's going to be expensive. So I would expect that you're going to see some of these prices trickle down. And, it's a year where the cap continues to go up. The cap pushed probably $5 million or so higher than maybe we even thought it was going to be. So if that's where we're talking, it's not going to be cheap to get these things done at this position. It's a big priority. We all heard that at the combine last week. I think it's very much something they want to get done. They know they need to, based on how their season ended. I mean, they take 9 sacks in a playoff game. I don't know how you can make that point much more emphatically than that, but it's not going to be a cheap problem to fix, I don't think.
Well, Ben, what did you make of Kevin O'Connell's, his comments at the combine when he kind of sort of walked back the criticism of the offensive line and saying, like, I don't know if I was necessarily talking about, what was the word he used? I can't remember, but he tried to walk back some of those comments he made after the season, when generally we get the most emotional, the most honest, candid kind of recaps of things are right after those games, but they can also be exaggerated. So just what did you make of the comments that he said at the combine following up on the O-line? And then do you think that actually changes anything about their outlook at that spot?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was interesting that he said that, and he was pretty, I mean, we saw it when he came into the press conference after that game. I mean, he was pretty emotional with that game ending the way it did, meaning the end of this ride where they're 14-2 playing for the first seed in the NFC, and all of a sudden 8 days later they're done. So there was certainly emotion behind that, but I also think I think a lot of that tracks with where they want to be, because we've heard a lot of things in other moments too. We've heard it enough that I think the need to do something with the offensive line is something they're very aware of. And probably a little bit of that was if he had stepped on some toes, rhetorically, I guess, that may have been where he was going with that. But I think their interest in the offensive line and fixing it is very real. What formula that takes, we will see. But no, I think a lot of that is pretty genuine in terms of them knowing they need to do something about it.
Yeah, and I agree with you completely that Trey Smith tag just showed you that the Chiefs had no interest in trying to compete for him on an open market and thought, you know what, this price is going to get so insane that we're going to slap that franchise tag on him. Since we like to have fun on this podcast, and these are the kind of notes that float around my desk when you cover the Vikings, I wrote down all the week one starting guards for them for the past 10 years. And just to take Vikings fans through this torture / memory lane and know that it's going to change again, because last year it was Blake Brandel and Ed Ingram. They went from starting Brandon Fusco and Mike Harris in 2015 to starting Alex Boone and Brandon Fusco the following year, to Nick Easton and Joe Berger, to Tom Compton and Mike Remmers, to Pat Elflein and Josh Klein, to Dakota Dozier and then Pat Elflein, to Ezra Cleveland, and then Oli Udoh. Remember Oli Udoh's?
I do remember Oli Udoh.
To Ezra Cleveland, then Ed Ingram. And then for the first time in 10 years, they had back-to-back same starting week one lineups with Ezra and Ed. And then last year was Blake and Ed. And we met to talk about free agency. Very few people expect Ed to maybe even be on this roster going into next season, considering he's going to get a pay bump that I don't believe is guaranteed. So
it's not. He's going to get that proven performance escalator based on playing time because he started enough. So he's going to be, I think, at a cap number of $5.2 million this year, but it's not guaranteed. So that seems like a hard number to imagine him being back.
Yeah, and for a guy who got benched after getting a long leash to show that he was worth that second round pick already, it just shows that the Trey Smith tag, the Vikings' dire need there, the coaches seemingly coming around to wanting some improvement there in terms of real resources, not just kind of making it work with what we've got kind of thing. I imagine they're going to go shopping for some guys and be competitive for what's left on that market because, Trey Smith would have made a ton of sense for them for a team that had a lot of cap room.
Kind of a similar situation on the flip side of the ball at the defensive tackle position. The Cowboys, they didn't franchise tag him, but they signed, I'm going to make sure I pronounce this right, Osa Odighizuwa to a 4-year, $80 million contract. He had been at the top of that defensive tackle market, just like Trey Smith had on the offensive side at guard. Andrew, you were talking similarly with me earlier today about how this is very much going to raise that market as well. We talked about Milton Williams in particular with the Eagles as someone who the Vikings might be intrigued in, but he might be a lot more expensive to attain now.
Yeah. Milton Williams is, I think, seems like he's a bigger name. Certainly had a little bit more sack production last year, and I think better pressure production than Osa did. But those guys both were going to be the top of the market. And when you look at what Christian Wilkins got last year with the Raiders, it was, I think, 27-ish million per year.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be shocked if Milton gets upward near that, over the 20 that Osa just got, into the mid 20s or whatever. And that's the highest paid defender on this Vikings team right now is Jonathan Grenard at 19 million. If you're bringing back Byron Murphy, he might have an argument to go above that. I feel like certainly if you're bringing in Milton Williams, you're going to have to go above that. And Ben, I'm fascinated to know how much they really want to improve that interior defensive line because it's going to cost them an incredible amount. And you know some names too that they might go shopping with in the mid-market or whatever. So there's some options for them, but Milton Williams is a guy that made a huge difference for the Eagles. You saw Javon Hargrave do the same thing and then go to San Francisco and have a big impact as well. They just churn out interior defensive linemen. So you could probably do worse than this guy, but it's going to cost them.
Yeah, it is. And I think it's also a year where we heard a lot of this at the combine, that this is a deep rookie class in the draft. So do they say we can solve this problem a little more cheaply by drafting one? I mean, again, they as we've talked about, they only have the 3 picks plus the comp third that they're probably going to get for Kirk Cousins. But that could be a place that they say in the first round, if there's a good value there, Derek Harmon is the name we've tossed around a little bit from Oregon. if they said this is the way to go with that 24th pick, that may make some sense. They have other needs. Corner is, I think, the big one, but are you going to get a corner that you want to start right away, especially for Brian Flores? I think that's an open question too. So if they sign Murphy, they maybe get another veteran corner. Maybe it's Shaq Griffin coming back. We'll see where that goes. But that defensive tackle market, they may look at and say, this is a problem that can be solved in the draft. It's funny because we talk about all this cap space, but when everybody's cap goes up, it's like $60 million in space doesn't go as far as it used to. And they will find ways to manipulate the cap numbers. The void years are going to be a thing. I think they've shown over the years that they can get a lot of things done because Rob Brzezinski managing their cap does it about as well as anybody in the NFL. But man, with the prices looking like where they could go, it's easy to eat up that money relatively quickly, especially if you are going to possibly, we'll see if this happens, but give any of that money to Sam Darnold.
Right.
Yeah, I think
yes.
I think I remember, was it Kwesi or Kevin? One of the two made that joke last year when the cap went up of like the other one. It must have been Kwesi saying, Kevin came into my office saying, we've got more cap room. And Kwesi being like, well, everybody does. So don't get too excited.
So I'll toss you both a couple questions here kind of in this vein. I guess first, and we might have just already answered this question, but I'm curious for something definitive or something, at least a take on it. Which position do you think the Vikings are going to spend the most on in free agency with where we stand now and what they need?
Boy, that's a good question. I mean, I could answer two ways there, I think, but maybe you'll have the other one.
Yeah, I would say cornerback.
Yeah.
I just feel like that's the spot where they want experience. They want guys who can come in, and they need guys who can come in and make an impact right away. But the names out there, I mean, there are a lot of names, whether it's DJ Reed, Carlton Davis, obviously Byron Murphy. There are a lot of guys that could come in and help them immediately. So I wouldn't be shocked if it's that, just knowing Brian Flores. But yeah, it could be any number of things right now, but I go corner.
Yeah, I mean, it was either going to be that or guard for me because I think they will spend at guard. But the corner market is interesting. Carlton Davis is a name that I would keep an eye on. I've heard a little bit to think that they may be pretty interested there. I mean, DJ Reed had a great game against them last year too. So those names could be in the mix, and I think they want to bring Byron Murphy back. So yeah, it would not be hard to go spend $40 million or just shy of $40 million on a couple of corners. I think it's a very good possibility as well. I think the guard thing is going to be a place where they spend. We'll see if it gets to that point, but those would be the two, I guess, that are in my mind because you really in both of those spots you probably need two. So it's an easy way to rack up the bill here pretty quickly, I think.
So neither of us think they're going to go sign Milton Williams. It sounds like.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you're talking that kind of money, if you're talking high 20s for him, which you probably are, if Christian Wilkins got that last year, boy, it's hard to do it. I mean, it depends how you structure the deal. The void years probably help, but it's hard to get everything you want when there are other teams that have money to spend as well.
Yeah, and it's an interesting. Oh, go ahead, Emily. Sorry.
Well, when you take it up to 500 feet, too, they have the draft coming after this. And albeit all the talk of not a lot of draft capital, which is certainly true, it's a good defensive tackle class. And I think I could very much see them spending that first round pick on a guy like Derek Harmon, Kenneth Grant, one of those kind of bigger names that's popped up early. And so, like, maybe you don't spend as much on a defensive tackle in free agency and put that money towards cornerbacks, I'd probably say spend the most on guards, just because I'm of the mindset that, like, offensive linemen, you want slightly tenured guys, especially when you're trying to fix a problem, the type of problem that the Vikings have. I don't know that you want to be converting a rookie like into an NFL system and putting all this weight on him to fix your run game, your goal line run game. So that's kind of where my head's at. But Andrew, what were you about to say?
I think the defensive line defensive tackle is an interesting calculation for a coaching staff that is so good at creating pressure and creating the right matchups, overloading, blitzing, the simulated pressures, just everything that they do to create havoc. it's that calculation Kwesi has to do of like, well, how much can I rely on my coaching staff to get the most out of whomever I throw at them, versus going out there and getting the guy that I know can win in any situation. Because boy, how good would this defensive line be if they had Jonathan Grenard, Dallas Turner in year 2, Andrew Van Ginkel, Milton Williams, Harrison Phillips? Like, that would be an incredible front for them. But at what cost? Does it come at the cost of an extra starting guard? Does it come at the cost of a mid-tier corner that they're going to bring in for depth or whatever, or the starting running back, who they do need to go out and re-sign as well? So it's a fascinating calculation, because we just know how good Flores is, and they know how good he is at creating this stuff on his own. And but I'm sure he's banging the table for wanting as much talent as possible too.
Am I remembering this wrong, or wasn't there a time where there's a scheme, like a setup Brian threw out there last year where like there weren't even any tackles on the field? Or so Brian doesn't even need them.
Yeah, their pass rush package ended up being all defensive ends. It was Jihad Ward counts as a defensive end, but he's like 270, 80 pounds. Like he's a big defensive end. And Pat Jones was also the same kind of thing. So you get these personnel groupings that look like these mad scientist thing. And it's like, well, Flores is also using Jihad Ward as an edge rusher and kind of so forth. So, but it's still, you're right. Like they can create, and Ben has written about how good Flores is at just doing whatever's in the cupboard. We're gonna make work. And so if you're Kwesi, you're like, all right, go do it again.
And I do think, and we saw it last year, that what Brian Flores wants will be the guiding principle they use with the defense and free agency. So if we apply that to last year, I mean, very clearly he wanted the edge rusher group to change. I mean, that was clear on day one when they go sign Grenard and Van Ginkel pretty quickly, and they add Blake Cashman as another linebacker. So they addressed that layer of the defense, that second layer of it, pretty quickly last year. And I think, Christian Wilkins was a priority for him as well. But yeah, I think we will see pretty early on where they want to go, because I'm sure a lot of their marching orders have come from Brian Flores saying, this is what I want. This is the type of player that I want to see in here, and these are the guys that I believe can fill this role. So, how much does the offensive side of the ball get a bigger chunk of the attention this year with those guard spots, or possibly with running back, figuring out what happens with Aaron Jones? I think it's going to be a fascinating thing to see as well. But Brian Flores will certainly have made his voice heard about where he wants this to go, and I think a lot of that will follow those orders, or follow those directives, I guess would be another way to put it.
The second question I had, and this is similar to an exercise we're doing in writing this week, where we're kind of playing GM, but who do you think among the Vikings free agents, guys that were rostered last year, like who do you think on each side of the ball they're most likely to bring back? Like give me your one or two. Obviously Byron Murphy would be smart for them to bring back. Are they going to pay that money, pay him more than Grenard to do it? Who knows?
That's interesting, because I would say on offense, I would say Aaron Jones would have seemed like a lock to come back. And I still think, obviously it's a possibility when they push that void date back, but that running back market's not great. Najee Harris, J.K. Dobbins. I mean, we've talked about this before. Like, if his price gets juiced up to the point where they're like, we love you, Aaron, but, you can go take that 3-year deal from whatever team. That'll be interesting to see. So I'm not sure it's going to be Aaron Jones at this point, but defensively, yeah, I think Byron Murphy Jr.'s, we've heard straight up that they want to prioritize him. They want to bring him back. It makes a ton of sense. It's just, will the crowded corner market, because there are some options, will that suppress his price at all? Will that mean that other teams are not willing to drive his price up as much? And maybe that leads him back here. So I would pick him. I think he's more likely to come back than Cam Bynum, let's say. But I don't think any of us would be shocked if they re-sign Bynum either. So, boy, let me go down the actual list, because I haven't looked at it in a hot minute. Ben, what do you got?
Well, I mean, defensively, I would agree with you. I think Murphy is the priority. I think they want to bring him back. I think that's something they know will be expensive, but he had the kind of year that you want to have in a contract year, as we've talked about. So I think it would be him. I think there's interest in Bynum. We'll have to see what the market looks like for him as well. But in terms of the offensive side of the ball, I mean, I don't know. I guess Jones at age 31 or about to be 31 years old, I don't know that the market will get so crazy that they can't afford him. So I guess I would think he's back. I mean, I suppose you could throw Darnold in this conversation or Daniel. We haven't talked about Daniel Jones at all.
Daniel Jones, that's what I thought you were going to say when you said Jones. I was like, oh, we got to Daniel Jones.
I screwed up. I saw Daniel Jones on the list and I went, yes, that's who I should have said.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly another possibility. I think that they would take a look at if it is, if Darnold's market turns out to be such that he's not coming back here, Daniel Jones, I do think, makes some sense to kind of play that Sam Darnold role in 2025. So, is that more likely than Aaron Jones? I don't know. But I would throw that name into the conversation as well without really, I guess I'm not taking a strong enough stance on this to pick one name and this is the guy. But yeah, I think there's a few there. The other name that I will throw into the conversation, again, I don't think this is going to happen, but Cam Robinson's interesting to me. He struggled enough at the end of the year that I wouldn't be surprised if they said, no, we're moving on. But they are going to have to figure out probably a temporary, at least insurance policy at left tackle, given the timing of that Christian Darrisaw injury. He may be back for training camp, may be ready to go by the start of the season, but I think they're going to have to think about that one too.
Yeah, and other guys, like other defenders who, not big names, but guys who are just fits we know they really like, and I wouldn't be shocked if they come back. Jonathan Bullard, Jihad Ward, even Jerry Tillery, who they felt made some good strides. He ended up losing some of his role at the end of the year to Jalen Redmond, but if he's affordable, I could see him coming back too. So there's some low-level guys that I wouldn't be shocked about. And then the one thing we can bank on, Emily, is that wherever Cam Akers goes, he will come back here via trade in around October, week 6, week 7, something like that. So we know Cam Akers will be back here at some point.
In some form. Well, we started the podcast with quarterbacks. Quarterbacks snuck in the middle here. I'll bring us back around quarterback adjacent to bring up the fact that the Vikings did hire a new offensive assistant, Jordan Traylor. He's 31. He'd spent the past 6 seasons in New Orleans with them. What I found really intriguing is he's done both sides of the ball work, which is interesting. I think obviously a great learning opportunity. 31. It feels weird to say learning opportunity at 31, but you are still learning at 31, especially as an NFL coach. We're all learning. You're all learning at 31. Yes. Yeah. That he'll have both O'Connell and Brian Flores here to learn with, but he's going to be the new Grant Udinski in that assistant offensive coordinator, assistant quarterbacks coach role, working alongside Josh McCown. Ben, I guess, what do you think about that hire? You got it confirmed. I know last night when that came through. Just what do you think of that hire? Yeah,
I think we knew they were going to do something there. I mean, I think this one makes some sense. Grant Udinski, it's interesting. We haven't really talked about this a lot, but he was a defensive end in college. So he had kind of a similar background in the sense that he'd been on that side of the ball and I think had actually moved to tight end, I want to say. So he'd had enough experience on both sides of the ball to have that kind of intuition about how defenses were going to play, which I think people felt like was really helpful in the way that he would break things down. So they're very much trying to recreate that role as much as they can. I don't know if you'll find a guy that's quite on that level. I mean, Grant Udinski is a pretty unique story, a pretty unique character in the guys that we've seen come through Minnesota. But yeah, it's very much trying to give that type of a presence on the offense and another voice probably to work with JJ McCarthy. I mean, that's one of the things here that we've talked about it a little bit, but JJ McCarthy and Grant Udinski were very close. JJ McCarthy thought very highly of Grant Udinski. So him not being here, I do think is something that McCarthy was, I know he was disappointed, very disappointed to see Grant Udinski leave. And I think Jordan Traylor developing that relationship with McCarthy early is going to be important because they're going to want that guy to kind of give some of that one-on-one instruction with McCarthy, especially if it were to be something where he's waiting a little bit longer to take over that job and he's not getting all of those reps in practice, especially during the regular season. So how Traylor and McCarthy hit it off and kind of the connection we hear between those two guys it's one of those kind of back burner plots that I'm interested in training camp, or probably even before that, because that was something McCarthy really valued in this offensive system and in this coaching staff, was that kind of resource that Grant Udinski was. So if Jordan Traylor is able to come in and be that type of a presence for McCarthy, I think it's a big deal.
I need to know what kind of car Jordan Traylor drives, because it was Liam Cohen, the Jaguars coach, who hired Grant Udinski, who said, Grant's just all ball. He drives just a Honda CRV, doesn't care about anything else other than ball. And so I got to know what kind of car a Traylor drives. If it's too nice, it's a bad sign.
Well, yeah, Grant was funny because you'd hear all these stories, and I heard some of these stories that I didn't end up putting in the story, but suffice it to say, he was not somebody that was spending a ton of time worrying about the finer things in life. When people would tell stories about his apartment, was like basically he'd have a bed and like a desk for sitting down to watch film, and then maybe a TV, and that was about it. It wasn't like I'm spending a ton of time decorating my apartment because it's time that takes away from football. I mean, really, the only thing that you ever heard about him taking away from football was his trips that gave Kevin O'Connell probably a few more gray hairs over the summer. So I don't know that he was terribly concerned with the whip, as the kids say. But maybe now that he's offensive coordinator, got a little more money, he'll go with something else. I think the CRV, I wonder, because there were stories at Baylor that he was like sleeping in his car when he first started there, and then the other coaches were like, dude, no, you don't need to do that. Come stay with one of the other coaches while you get settled. But
wow.
He's not somebody that is afraid of roughing it. I mean, staying at hostels on his summer trips, I think probably also tells you he's not afraid to, have to get into the muck a little bit if he needs to do it. So he's probably not terribly concerned about it.
Well, one more point on this. It is an interesting situation for Kevin O'Connell, because Grant Udinski was the riser who got kind of plucked a few rungs above the ladder, kind of skipped a few spots. And it's not like they lost McCown, because if they did, Udinski would have been the natural promotion into that, quarterback coach role. So instead they lose the young guy who they kind of O'Connell viewed as kind of this guy that eventually would keep taking on bigger roles every year. And that's the guy they have to replace now and Traylor. So they bring in a 31-year-old who they kind of clearly must view as this young guy who has a very bright future ahead of him.
Yeah, I mean, the whole makeup of that staff is really interesting, because let's play that out for a second. If McCown had left and Udinski gets the QB coach job, does he settle for that, or does he say, you know what, I have OC possibilities out here?
Yeah.
I mean, where would that have gone? I don't know, but if you lose both of those guys, that becomes a big problem in your quarterback development kind of machine that they have developed here. So, Wes Phillips, they still think very highly of, and people are kind of like, what's Wes Phillips' role here? It's like Wes Phillips is thought of highly in that building. It's not something where everybody's saying, oh, this, you see all these things on social media. What exactly does he do? It's like he spends a lot of time with, whether it's game plan or being a kind of a check for Kevin O'Connell, working with the offense as a whole. There's still a pretty integral role for him, and I think there could be a contract extension coming for him and Brian Flores this spring here, now that Kevin O'Connell's deal done. My understanding is that one of the things O'Connell wanted to emphasize with this is, let me take care of my staff. Let me make sure that these guys are getting paid. That's something that, over the years, we've not seen the Vikings always excel at what they pay assistant coaches. I think you're going to see, probably not publicly, but you'll see a push to get more of those things done. So where does all of that go with the offensive staff? I think it would have been really interesting if Josh McCown had left to see how they played all of that. But even as it is, like, Udinski was kind of in this spot where there was going to be a bottleneck with Phillips, McCown, obviously Kevin O'Connell calling plays above all of them. But yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see how Traylor fits in, because I do think, we say assistant quarterbacks coach, like, what's the big deal? I think for them, that role is a lot more important than we might believe it is just by looking at the title.
Well, and they've talked so much about how they constantly want like as much one-on-one attention with players across the board. And when you have 5 quarterbacks in a room, you have to have more than one coach.
Right.
Josh McCown simply cannot do it all as much as he might like to, or other teams might think that one QB coach. That's not the philosophy that Kevin O'Connell subscribes to. So certainly interesting trailer. We'll find out, I'm sure, what his own little intricacies of his personality are, as we found out with Grant Udinsky.
We'll see what I can dig up. Let's see if he's quite as interesting as Grant Udinsky, but I'll see what I can find out.
We'll find out what his connection to this staff is, which is not Johnny Manziel. We worked out earlier. Yeah. We thought it might be Johnny Manziel, but it isn't. Ben, what were you going to say?
He missed it by a year. Yeah, I was just going to say the other reason for keeping this coaching staff, kind of keeping this pipeline developing, is that they are going to go through this a lot. It is a quarterback-driven league, the Star Tribune has learned. If you're a quarterback coach or a coach that works in the vicinity of quarterbacks, you are going to have opportunities to move up. And if you are getting to the point where you're working for the NFL Coach of the Year, a guy whose work with quarterbacks is viewed very highly around the league, you may start to see some of this pipeline like what we've seen with Sean McVay and the Rams. Now, the obvious counter to that is Sean McVay has playoff wins. Kevin O'Connell does not. And that's a really quick way to kind of halt the narrative of this up-and-coming coach, this up-and-coming coaching staff, if they can't figure out the playoffs thing. Yeah, Andrew's holding up his hand. The ring matters to all of this stuff. Yes. If they continue to progress and have playoff success, they are going to see people come in and try to grab these coaches. So that's where the pipeline matters, I think, as well. You need to have the next guy ready to go that you say, well, okay, Josh McCown got hired. Josh McCown has had head coaching interviews already. I mean, we have a couple of these cases where these guys are jumping 2 levels in terms of what they're interviewing for. And if he were to leave for one of those at some point, you need to have the next guy ready to go. So I think all of these lower level hires do become a little more important simply because those guys could turn into integral parts on this coaching staff pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
The coaching carousel should finally be done for this offseason. I think that fills both of the Vikings holes that they had after all of the chaos that went on there. But free agency carousel is about to start up for real. So thank you guys for listening and or watching this episode of the podcast. We will continue covering the Sam saga, the Darnold discourse, whatever you want to call it, through next week and the rest of the off season as this all progresses. But please check out our work on thestartribune.com, and we'll talk to you next time.